Welcome everybody. I am so bad at shushing people, unfortunately. But if you could shush, that would be excellent. Thank you. My name is Chris Wildeman. I'm the director of the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research, which is one of the co-sponsors of Bruce's talk, along with the Institute for the Social Sciences, the Cornell Population Center, and the Center for the Study of Inequality. I am really bad at introductions and don't like them, so I will keep this very brief. Bruce is also my advisor from graduate school, and I still live in vaguely constant fear of him. So I don't want to mess anything up too badly until we're out at dinner. So our speaker today is Bruce Western. He's a professor of sociology and co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia University. He's in a bunch of fancy societies. He's won a bunch of fancy awards. He's been in a bunch of fancy places. But the thing that I want to talk to you about very briefly today is that I think Bruce is really the seminal scholar of mass incarceration in the world. And in addition to having written sort of the book that really kind of launched this field to the center of discussions about inequality, punishment and inequality in America, he's also contributed sort of a host of articles and also a host of service around this issue to really bring it to the forefront. And so even though I could list a bunch of awards, I really just wanted to focus on that as somebody who works in this same field. His talk today is on his book, Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison. We'll have a reception afterwards for about an hour, so please feel free to stay and join us. And those of you who got a free copy of the book, it would be very appropriate and welcomed by Bruce to make him sign it with something witty afterwards. So a final sort of closing remark. Thanks so much for coming out, even though the probability that you're going to get drenched on the way back wherever you're going is very high. I appreciate that. It's no fun to have an event get functionally canceled by weather. So welcome, Bruce.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, and it's a real treat to be here at Cornell to talk about my new book, Homeward, and I feel like I've got lots of friends here at the campus, and so it's a real treat for me to be invited, and I'm very grateful to have the chance to visit. So what I thought I would do is spend a little bit of time talking about this new book. It's called Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison. And before jumping in, that's my screensaver. In case you want to know the time, we've got a time check. Before I jump into talking about the book, I thought I'd try and provide a little bit of context for the research that I was doing. And so this is a book about a group of men and women who were coming out of prison in Massachusetts and returning to neighborhoods in the Boston area. And the way I got to that study was somewhat circuitous, and I spent a long time before working on this Boston reentry study doing very different kinds of research. And I want to begin by talking to you a little bit about that. And there's going to be sort of like a play in 3 acts. And Act 1 is the motivation for the book, which is the problem of mass incarceration. And for people who are steeped in this field, the problem of mass incarceration may be very, very familiar. But for others, you may need some empirical context. So you measure the size of the penal system in a country with an incarceration rate. And typically that's expressed as the number of people who are locked up on a given day per 100,000 of the population. And if we think about Western Europe, The incarceration rate of Western European countries is around about 100 per 100,000, about 0.1 of 1% of the population of Western European countries are locked up on any given day. In the United States, the incarceration rate is almost an order of magnitude larger. It's 700 per 100,000. Now, we can also think about how unusual the American penal system is in historical terms, and we have good data that go back to the 1920s. And from the period from 1925 to the early 1970s, the imprisonment rate in the United States was about 100 per 100,000, about what it is in Western Europe today. But in the early 1970s, imprisonment in the United States began to grow, and it grew every year for about the next 35 years. So we're in a very historically unusual period right now in which the scale of imprisonment is about 5 times larger than its historic average. What does this mean in terms of numbers? It means that there are about 1.6 million people in state or federal prison. So these are people who are serving prison time for a felony, which is 12 months at the minimum, typically, and about 28 months of time served at the median. Some people are serving very much longer sentences than that. We have about 50,000 people in the United States who are serving life without parole sentences. They're never going to be released. In Western Europe, the number of people serving life without parole sentences is about 40 or 50. So we have very long sentences in the United States as well as a very high rate of incarceration. That's not the entire penal population, because we have another 730,000 people who are locked up in local jails. And these are people who are either serving short sentences or they're legally innocent but detained and waiting trial. Now, that's not the whole correctional population, because there are also people out in the community under correctional supervision. There are 850,000 people in America who are on parole. That's not the entire community corrections population, because there's another 4 million people on probation. You add this all up and you've got about 7 million people in the United States now who are under some sort of correctional supervision, and this is historically new, right? These very high rates of incarceration have only emerged in the last decade or so. Now, striking as these figures are, this is not what's most important about incarceration in America. The most important thing about incarceration in America is its unequal distribution across the population. So everything I've shown you so far is just a snapshot at a point in time. What's the number of people who are incarcerated in a given year, for example? But we might be able to think about incarceration in a different way. What's the likelihood someone's ever going to serve time in prison at some point in their lives? And we might want to think about imprisonment in this sense of a cumulative risk, because we think that serving time in prison confers a whole array of disadvantages that you experience even after you've been released. And we want to know, well, how large is the group that's at risk of these adverse life chances as a result of imprisonment? So in some research with Becky Pettit, a demographer at the University of Texas at Austin, we asked, well, think about a birth cohort born in the late 1940s. So these are people who are reaching their mid-30s in 1979. And what are the chances that a group of people born in the late 1940s are ever going to go to prison at some point in their lives by 1979? And if we think about white men and African American men at different levels of schooling, just focusing on black men who have never been to college, and that's about half of all black men. We estimated that about 12% of those men were going to go to prison at some point in their lives. If they dropped out of high school, we estimated that 15% of them have been to prison. So let's compare this group to another birth cohort, a birth cohort born in the late 1970s. So if you're born in the late 1970s, you're reaching your mid-30s around 2009, 2010, right? A generation later. What's the lifetime risk of imprisonment for this birth cohort? So now this is a birth cohort that's growing up through the American prison boom. So for this group, this recent birth cohort born in the late 1970s, non-college African American men, about half of all African American men, about 35% we're estimating have been to prison now. If they dropped out of high school, so less than 12 years of completed education, about 70% have been to prison. So within a generation, incarceration, imprisonment, has become a regular life event for African American men with very low levels of schooling. It's historically new, and it's happened fundamentally not because of changes in the level of crime and criminal involvement. Crime rates are much lower than they used to be for the younger cohort compared to the older cohort. The rate of imprisonment is much higher because of changes in policy, changes in sentencing policy that have made prison the presumptive punishment for a felony conviction. So there was a lot of research around this problem. What are the implications of these extraordinary rates of incarceration for disadvantaged men and the communities in which they live? And researchers looked at labour market outcomes and people's earnings and employment are diminished by serving time in prison. People looked at outcomes, the health outcomes of people after they get out of prison, and people are at really increased risk of mortality immediately after prison release. People looked at outcomes of children whose parents have been incarcerated, and children are also at risk of a whole variety of bad outcomes. They tend to do worse academically. The socioeconomic conditions in which they live are worse when a parent gets incarcerated. Chris has done a lot of path-breaking work in this area on the effects of parental incarceration on the well-being of children. So there's a vast research literature that's grown up in the last 15 years that's trying to understand the consequences of the emergence of mass incarceration for very disadvantaged people. And if I was to summarise this very large research literature, I would do it in the following way. Mass incarceration has criminalised social problems related to racial inequality and poverty, and these social problems include the problems of violence and other crime, but they also include social problems like untreated addiction, untreated mental illness, homelessness, that are also pathways into the criminal justice system. So mass incarceration has criminalised a whole variety of social problems that are related to racial inequality and poverty, and it's contributing to the reproduction of poverty and racial inequality because of all of the negative consequences that incarceration has for people and their families and their communities, even after people are released from prison. Now, a lot of this research was summarised by a report of the National Academy of Sciences. There was a National Academy's consensus panel that reported on this very large research program, and the main conclusion was that given the small crime prevention effects of long prison sentences And there's a whole research literature on the effects of incarceration on crime, and the crime-reducing effects of incarceration are usually estimated to be pretty small. Given the small crime prevention effects, the long prison sentences, and the possibly high financial, social, and human costs of incarceration, federal and state policymakers should revise current criminal justice policies to significantly reduce the rate of incarceration in the United States. This was the headline recommendation of the National Academies panel on very high rates of incarceration in the United States. So this is sort of where I was, I guess, around 2010 or something like that. I've been doing a lot of work on the demographic contours of incarceration, particularly the effects of incarceration on people's economic opportunities. But I wasn't, I think I got to a point with this work where I wasn't 100% convinced by it. I was analysing large social survey data sets that were not really designed to study the problem of incarceration and how people did with their families and in the labour market and so on after they went to prison. At this time, I was going into prison a lot. I was teaching in prison, and I was coming to know people who are incarcerated. I was coming to know people who worked in the system, and the kinds of lives of my students in prison weren't very well represented by the survey data I was analysing. The big data sets, I think, have taught us a lot, but the granular social process of leaving prison and returning to a community were not very well measured by these big data sets. And I worried a lot about undercoverage. I worried that surveys designed to cover the general population weren't very good at teaching us about the life experiences of very, very poor people who often had very unstable housing and were struggling with problems like untreated mental illness and addiction. The surveys tended to undercover people who were very socially and economically marginal. So I thought we needed a different way of collecting data, a different way of learning about this problem. So that's the end of Act 1. Act 2, the reentry study. This is my effort to try and understand the life experience of people, coming out of prison. And I was working with two other researchers, Anthony Braga, who's at Northeastern University, and Rihanna Cole, who's the research director at the Department of Correction in Massachusetts. And we designed a study where we would talk to people just before they left prison. We would go into prison and we would interview people at prison a week before they were released, and then 2 weeks later we would meet with them again, but out on the community side. And then we would meet with them again 2 months after their prison release, and then again 6 months after prison release and 12 months after prison release. And we'd try and find out in a very granular way what the experience of incarceration and leaving incarceration, returning to community was like. We were focused on things like employment, housing, health, people's family relationships, their drug use, their criminal involvement, their criminal justice system contact. This was the Boston reentry study. We wound up going into nearly every prison in the Massachusetts system. We were interviewing men and women, so we went into men's facilities and women's facilities at all different levels of security. We did interviews in non-contact units with people behind plexiglass. We interviewed people in disciplinary segregation who were shackled when they spoke to us and they were releasing to the street from solitary confinement. We went into the state psychiatric hospital and interviewed people who had been committed there with serious mental illness. And so we were getting a broad cross-section of the state prison population. So what did we learn? There's a lot I could say about the data and the findings from the data. I want to focus on just 3 things for today. The first really striking thing, I think, from the data is, and I was not attuned to this remotely when we began our field period, but we got to know people pretty well. And we were meeting with people 5 times over the course of a year. We were checking in with them by phone, we were texting them all the time, and so we were communicating with our respondents a lot. And over time, people were speaking to us about the violence that they had known in their lives. And certainly some of the people we were interviewing had been convicted of violent offences, and some of them were very serious violent offences. But they were also exposed to violence in childhood, and their initial experiences of violence in childhood were as victims and as witnesses in many cases. There was a lot of family violence in the home of the people that we spoke to, and a serious exposure to trauma in childhood. That was one finding. Second finding, people are in poor health. People in prison are in poor health. And this really means 2 things. One, it means that mental health is poor, so high rate of mood disorders, a lot of depression. Nearly all the women we interviewed reported that they had received diagnoses of depression. So poor mental health, a subset, about 20% of the people we were talking to, had serious mental illness, so psychotic conditions, bipolar disorder. We had a number of schizophrenics in the sample. The third major finding is there is incredible material hardship after prison, very low incomes, very, very acute housing insecurity, and I'll talk more a little bit about that. So let me show you a little what the data look like. Trauma in childhood. So we weren't attuned to the problem of childhood trauma, exposure to violence, when we went into the study. We hadn't planned to ask about that, but we were hearing about it from the respondents. So we decided in the middle of our field period to significantly redesign our exit interview to include questions that asked about exposure to violence and trauma in childhood. And these are the sorts of things we're seeing. So this is simply the percentage of people in our sample of 122 men and women released from state prison. Over half grew up in families in which there was, they reported to us there was a serious problem of drug addiction. About half were beaten by their parents. 40% of our sample had witnessed a death, had witnessed someone being killed while they were growing up. About 40% of the sample, their parents lost custody of them in one way or another. Either they were committed to Department of Youth Services or Family Services, they were put into foster care, or they went to live with extended family. Family members were victims of crime, high rates of family violence, mental health problems, suicidality in the families that people were growing up in. 20% reported they were sexually abused as children. A lot of trauma, a lot of victimization in the sample that significantly exceeds general population estimates. Poor health. So what's going on in the sample? Very high rates of substance abuse, high rates of depression, high rates of chronic pain, which was often related to sustained drug use. Lots of chronic disease, lots of infectious disease, again, often related to drug use. About a quarter of our sample were heroin users. We also heard many reports of anxiety, PTSD, and psychotic conditions. The interesting thing is that these two things are related. That exposure to trauma in childhood, if we take all of those markers of trauma and add them up and create a simple scale, trauma is closely related to poor physical and mental health in adulthood. The people who are struggling most with their physical and mental health and have a cluster of conditions in adulthood that they're dealing with, they are exposed to the most trauma in childhood. In particular, if people were reporting to us that they were abused as kids, their health in adulthood was especially poor. If people were in poor health, if they suffered from this cluster of mental illnesses and physical conditions, which we called human frailty, their reentry experiences were particularly challenging. For the frail, which are indicated by the yellow lines here, for the frail, they were more likely to be using heroin in their first year after prison release. They were much more likely to be unstably housed, so that meant in a shelter or transitional housing or street homeless. And they were much more likely to be unemployed in the year after prison release. So there's a chain of events going on here where exposure to trauma is related to poor health, is related to significant hardship in the process of trying to make this transition from prison back to community. So everything I've shown you so far kind of looks a lot like the research I was doing before on these big national data sets, but I felt at least I was getting at this social process. This social process of making the transition from prison to community. But as I was analysing data and talking in our research team about how to write this up, I felt something was still missing. The lives of the respondents, as I'd come to know them we're in the field for about 3 years. Our follow-up period was only a year, but our field period was much longer because people were recruited over a relatively long period of time. So their lives were somehow missing from the kind of quantitative analysis I just showed you. And so I thought it was also important to try and engage more seriously with people's life stories and try and engage with their experiences at a more human level, which was unfamiliar territory for me. It wasn't my training. It wasn't work I had done before. But I felt an important part of the social reality I was observing was in those stories. So I want to read you a little bit from the book. It's only a short passage to give you a flavour of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So this is a short passage about a man called Peter, or a respondent called Peter. Peter was an older black man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and an elegant bearing. He arrived early for our interview a week after release. Waiting on the street, he was hesitant to face the crowd and enter the diner in Mattapan. We began the interview by asking Peter, what's the best part of being out? Breathing fresh air, he said. What's the most challenging thing? Being around a bunch of people, just being in public areas. Although he got anxious in crowds, Peter began his latest release with a flurry of activity. He came home on a Friday, and on that morning he bought clothes and he got a haircut. He spent time with his sister that first day and stayed over at her house. 5 other people were living in his sister's house, including her fiancé, 1 adult son and 2 younger children. Peter worried that he was a burden on what was already a crowded family home. He could have stayed with his father, but his father drank. His brother also stayed there and he was dealing drugs. Being at my father's wasn't a healthy situation. My sister's is the safest place for me, he said. Peter spent his first weekend home with his 9-year-old son. They talked and did some shopping and went to the movies. And on his first Monday after getting out, he reported to probation in the morning and then visited his father in the afternoon. On Tuesday, he enrolled in food stamps and then met with his older son later in the day. He went to the welfare office again on Wednesday and then visited his younger son's school to introduce himself to the boys' teachers. Thursday was mental health counselling. By the end of his first week out, Peter had spent time with 2 of his 3 children, enrolled in food stamps, obtained a mass transit card, made an appointment for counselling, checked in with several shelters, and visited a career centre. The following week, he would begin his job search. So this is what the transition from prison to community looks like on the ground. And in the book, I argue that the overwhelming reality that faces people who have been to prison has 3 main characteristics: poverty, racial inequality, and violence. And in the policy debates about re-entry and criminal justice reform more generally, we're often not very good at talking about any of these things, and we're certainly not very good at talking about all of these things together. For liberal criminal justice reformers, the issue of violence poses a significant challenge. Violence is a very difficult issue to talk about in the criminal justice reform conversation. We tend to reserve our leniency, our mercy, and our compassion for so-called non-violent drug offenders. I want to show a clip of Peter talking about violence and incarceration.
As a kid, I thought my father was the toughest person. I thought the only person that was fair to me was my father. When I went to prison, I found out my father wasn't shit. He was scared of me. I stabbed 4 people in one day. I didn't care. I didn't care.
How old were you?
19, 20.
Yeah. And what happened after that?
I went to the hole.
Yeah.
I went to the hole, and that's when they sent me up the wall. You know? But
Yeah.
and from there it was just uphill. Nothing but violence.
Yeah.
Violence. But I was never like that. I thought that I can go to jail and just stay to myself, do my time, and get out. Nope.
So Peter's experience, I think, suggests how violence can be sustained over the life course. It shows how the prison itself is a source of violence in people's lives. And this raises the question for me whether incarceration on a massive scale can ever be a successful anti-violence strategy. And yet it was the strategy we chose. So if not incarceration, what? Could we reimagine a criminal justice system that takes on the real social conditions of poverty and racial inequality and violence over the life course. If we think about reentry specifically, there are 3 areas in which there are really acute needs, really acute policy needs. Transitional housing, income support, and healthcare. They're the really serious needs that we saw talking to people coming out of prison in Massachusetts. But with mass incarceration in America, the prison itself has become a major public policy challenge. Prisons, for all their effects, create an important event, leaving. And that begins a struggle for social belonging. And so the key lesson of the reentry study, I think, says something deep about the nature of incarceration. We usually think of incarceration as the deprivation of liberty, a loss of autonomy. But the men and women leaving prison in Boston were also disconnected from the intimate bonds of family and friendship and community. Incarceration is not just a deprivation of liberty, it's a disruption and distortion of social bonds. The fundamental justice challenge, I think, involves strengthening the bonds of family and community for victims and offenders alike in the aftermath of violence and other harm. Victims and offenders, in many cases, are not 2 different classes of people, but one and the same. Policies that improve the material well-being and empower people will help meet the challenges of poverty and human frailty, which is the social environment in which mass incarceration lives. Designing social policy according to these principles will help relieve the justice system of much of its unwanted and ill-equipped responsibility for the very, very harsh conditions of American poverty. So I sort of find myself sliding into a policy talk here, and but the lesson I really want to try and leave you all with, and the one that I really take from the reentry study, is that successfully leaving prison involves a very human process of transformation. I want to show another clip of Peter, and he's talking about this transformation.
I was taking my son to New York, my youngest son to New York, to get him a suit to go to his brother's funeral, and my mother called me because she had found out what happened. And I cried all the way to New York. My son was in the back seat asleep, but I can see that he was going through it mentally. He was going through it mentally, and I cried. And I asked my mother, I told my mother, I said, Mom, if I change my life, will he take care of us? And she was like, who? And I was like, God, if I change my life, is he take care of us? And she was like, yeah. She said, yeah, just trust and believe, he'll take care of me. So I made a decision to change my life. He's taking care of us.
Yeah.
He's taking care of us.
Yeah.
As a kid.
So for me, this clip is like the great paradox of mass incarceration. It illustrates what we're up against. So this system we've created demands, I think, heroic feats of personal transformation, individual transformation. But it's demanding these heroic feats of transformation from people whose agency is often deeply compromised by trauma and frailty. And I could talk to you a lot more about reentry policies and programs and what works, but at a human level, I think we need justice policy to welcome and secure a place for people who have been drawn into violence in different ways, whether it's the violence of street crime or the state violence of mass incarceration. And this is how community can play a part in this task of personal transformation. I want to tell one last story that I hope can suggest all of the possibility that lies before us. So I was in Addis Ababa a few years ago for a research project we had studying justice institutions in Ethiopia. And I was at a dinner with two Ethiopian researchers, and one of them, his name was Mulugeta, told me about a colleague at his research institute. He was a German anthropologist. And one day the anthropologist was out in a remote area and he was driving through a small village and his car tragically struck a small child, killing her. The girl's parents ran outside to see what happened and a crowd quickly formed around the anthropologist. The parents tended to the child and the anthropologist was asked that the police be called. But he was told that there weren't any police there. The village dealt with matters like this by itself. And he was told that he could go, but they'd send for him in a few days. So he returned to Addis, and later that week a message came for him that he had to return to the village. And he was told that he had to return alone. So he went to my friend Mulugeta and he asked what he should do. And Mulugeta said, "You have to go back to the village." So he went back to the village, and when he got there, he was escorted to a meeting with the elders of the village. And first he was told to pay 2,500 birr, that's about $125, to the family of the dead child. And next he was ordered by the meeting to buy a goat for the family. And he purchased the goat, which was immediately slaughtered. And the father of the dead child was called to the front of the meeting. And the anthropologist, who was already standing at the front of the room, was told to hold out his hand. And so he held out his hand, and his wrist was bound to the wrist of the child's father with the entrails of the goat. And the village elder then announced that the anthropologist was now a member of the dead girl's family. And that was that. He was free to go. So the anthropologist returned to Addis and he was very upset. He felt he hadn't properly compensated the family and he hadn't been punished. And Mulugeta said, "You have to understand that for the rest of your life, you're now a part of that man's family. You have all of the obligations of a family member. You have to visit from time to time. If they're going through problems that you might help with, you should help them, just as a member of their own family would." So Western ideas about punishment and retribution were radically absent in this case of customary justice in Ethiopia. And like the Ethiopian story, the problem of prisoner reentry raises the question of when does punishment end? When and how are debts extinguished? And these questions are as ethical as they are empirical. And I've tried to maintain this ethical perspective throughout my work. To guide politics or policy, the ethics of punishment, I think, has to confront the real lives of people who are incarcerated. By testing our values against the real conditions of poverty, racial inequality and violence that surrounds mass incarceration, I hope that we might imagine a better path to justice. So thank you very much.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions. I will circulate with the mic, so just signal me and I'll go from person to person. So someone signal me.
No questions.
Coming.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm interested in, after the 12 months were up, did your research continue? And if so, how?
It was only designed to follow up with people for a year, but we kept in touch with a number of people after that year. And it tended to be people that we'd gotten to know very well through the study. I sometimes think, we're observing a very turbulent period in people's lives, and certainly by the end of the year, some people were beginning to find steady jobs, move into households, and so on. But a significant fraction didn't, and they continued to struggle with their housing, struggled to stay sober, and there's an enormous amount of variation within the prison population. I think we often think of the problem of reentry as one kind of problem, but in fact it's many. For the older people in particular that we were talking to, they were the most socially isolated, the least supported, and they've continued to live in a very unstable way after the study had finished.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. What did you find were the highest predictors of recidivism among the cohort that you studied?
There were three. The strongest predictor of return to custody, which was how we were thinking about it, was relapse to addiction. And so people who told us at baseline that drugs or alcohol had been a problem in their lives, if they were using drugs after prison release, that was very closely related to return to custody. And it could mean a lot of different things. Sometimes it meant failing a drug test while you were on parole and violating the conditions of your release. Sometimes it meant committing new crimes in order to support your habits. Sometimes it meant committing new crimes because you're on a bender and you get into fights and other kinds of conflicts. So relapse to addiction. Second one was being on parole, was a very strong predictor of return to custody. Parole has become a surveillance bureaucracy, and most of parole in Massachusetts was monitoring conditions of compliance. Parole officers had very little to offer people when they were out of compliance, which typically meant failing a drug test or even a police stop, and that was another main pathway back to custody. And the third thing was we observed a highest rate of return to custody among young people. And that's a common finding in criminology, and the young people that we're interviewing were still deeply embedded in friendship networks where the friends that people were hanging out with were still involved in crime and still very much on the radar of police and much more likely to be stopped by police and arrested. So those were the big three. For me, all of these mean that we should be thinking about public policy in a fundamentally different way. Something is quite wrong if the health problem of relapse to addiction is the strongest predictor of return to custody.
Thank you so much. My question is, my question is, these were results that you found in Massachusetts, so I was just curious if you think that these would be replicated equally across the country, especially considering that there are such different, I guess, conditions in different places across the country.
Yeah. I think the experience of people in Massachusetts looks a lot like the experience of incarceration and reentry in the Northeast. And demographically, our sample and their criminal history and their life histories look very similar to what we know from other incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people in the Northeast. In many ways, Massachusetts and Boston is a best case scenario. This is as good as the process of reentry can look. Everyone in our sample was enrolled in Mass Health. Massachusetts is the original Medicaid expansion state, so everyone had Medicaid. Everyone, a large proportion of our sample, 80-85% of our sample, were enrolled in food stamps. In a lot of states, a criminal conviction makes you ineligible for food stamps. And the economy of Massachusetts and of Boston was quite strong during our survey period. So we observed enormous material hardship after prison release, average income, median income of $6,000 in the sample, deep poverty. And this is as good as it can possibly look, I think.
Thank you so much. So I was just wondering, given like the reincarceration rates in terms of mental health and drug addiction, do you think that like the nature of the parole system could be changed in a way that it would be more beneficial to providing treatment for those kind of things, or is it more of a deeper issue that can't be treated?
I think, historically, the analysis that's normally provided about parole is that it's changed from something that looked much more like case management and social work into a law enforcement function, and I think the training of parole officers has changed, and the work they do has changed. They now deal with much larger caseloads than they used to have, and they have very few tools to help people if they're struggling with their health or with addiction or housing or employment. So what does the alternative look like? Can we go back to that old case management model with parole? I think it probably wasn't a great model to begin with. I think if the objective as a matter of public policy is to help people find housing and employment and healthcare after they come out of prison, then we need to engage the agencies that do that. Departments of Labour, Departments of Public Health, Departments of Housing. And the big difference, I think, with pulling on the social policy levers rather than the criminal justice levers is that these are non-blaming institutions. Criminal justice institutions, at their core, are blaming institutions. And so the power of rearrest and violation always lie behind any assistance that's provided. If we're thinking about the problem of drug addiction and relapse to addiction, you talk to case managers in that field, and they'll tell you relapse is part of recovery. And if relapse is part of recovery, a parole officer that has to violate you and return you to custody when you fail a drug test, is not going to successfully participate in your recovery. And social policy agencies, which are at least less blaming than criminal justice agencies, I think are the way we should be thinking about policy reform.
Okay. So based on your research, it's like clear that the criminal justice system needs to be reformed, but like the prison industrial complex is so large and it's such a large business and part of our economy that it seems almost impossible to ever change because it's just such a big business. I was like wondering what you think would need to happen to actually change our policies to be more like reform-based and actually help our inmates.
Yeah, so I think, you know, we're in a really exciting moment right now. For 35 years, the incarceration rate increased year after year after year. And for most of my career, every year things got worse while I was studying this problem. And then in the last 7 or 8 years, things have begun to change. And a new kind of criminal justice conversation is emerging, and there's a ton of criminal justice reform going on around the country. There's a lot of drug defelonization, so drug offences that used to be felonies have now been reduced to misdemeanors. Probation and parole departments are curtailing revocation, so they're not violating people, returning them to custody on technical violations. There's bail reform. This is happening around the country now. And the bail, cash bail in the United States, which is a bizarre institution that only exists here, is propped up fundamentally by the bail bonds industry, right? But jurisdictions are experimenting with bail reform. There are convenings of district attorneys. There are new models of prosecution that are beginning to gain attention. So I think, I'm optimistic. I think we're entering a new conversation about criminal justice reform. I think there's lots of different impulses behind it. Some of it is about cutting state budgets because correctional budgets are massive and very costly. Some of it comes from the right wing of politics. There's a libertarian impulse that says mass incarceration is a government program that's just run amok. Some of it is a values conversation, trying to elevate ideas about redemption and second chances. And again, the conservative side of politics is playing a role in that too. In fact, I think a lot of the energy for criminal justice reform is coming as much from the conservative side as from the liberal side. So I'm encouraged. I think what's missing is an alternative vision of what justice could look like. To me, it has to be something more than just shrinking the system. It's not just about going back to the incarceration rate of 1972, because we still have to struggle with very deep problems of violence in context of racial inequality and poverty. And this is where the criminal justice system has come to live. And so I feel we need a positive public policy vision of how to deal with those problems. And fundamental reform, I think, will have to grapple with those problems. Is that going to happen? I think it's a very, very open political question. Right now, a lot of the changes that have happened have been small scale and incremental. And this is how I think we need to make a breakthrough to more fundamental change.
So I think we should end on a moment of optimism. I think all the answers to other questions will be more of a downer than that. So this is a good moment for us to end. So Bruce, thank you, and please feel free to stay for the reception or to get books signed.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Oh, what a pleasure. That was terrific. Thank you.
It was really great. Would you mind putting your